and welcome to episode 4 of the Blue Values Journey podcast, featuring Professor Rose Boswell, who is the South African Research Chair in Ocean Cultures and Heritage. I'm David, your host, and this episode is titled The Feminist Eye. Rose begins by explaining why the idea of the feminist eye is useful in the context of ocean cultures and heritage.
I see quite an interesting and potentially generative link between feminism and decoloniality, because it allows us to question power of particular perspectives and the endurance of particular ways of perceiving and engaging with social phenomena. And so while I recognize that the word feminism and feminist might be triggering to some who do not agree to the kinds of boundaries that such a particular term might present, I think it does provide us with a tool to better understand the blue space and the ocean economy in inverted commas, as well as the space of ocean cultures and heritage. I think the way in which I'm trying to approach it is to say, well, are we perceiving this context of ocean development and ocean exploration, ocean use, from a largely patriarchal, hegemonic, very capitalist maybe perspective? And is there a way of either subverting or challenging or nuancing the narrative of the ocean so that we can see the importance of conserving the ocean and the diverse reasons for doing it? I really like the idea of the feminist eye because it allows us to use a particular perspective and a set of tools that can help us to provide greater diversity into this narrative of ocean management. At the moment, the way in which we are experiencing ocean management in Southern Africa, and of course that depends very much on where you're standing in the story of ocean management, whether you are a coastal real estate developer or whether you're involved in offshore exploration or whether you are involved in the sustainability of marine life. It depends on where you are. It's a very useful tool because it encourages us, as Chimamanda Adichie says, it challenges us to not take the single story of the ocean, to perhaps use other tools, other analytical tools, other perspectives to engage with ocean management.
You've mentioned single stories and analytical tools. Could you give us examples of stories that are not the usual ones and perhaps analytical tools that are not the dominant ones that could be used in the feminist approach to ocean and culture?
In South Africa, at the very start of our project, we did fieldwork in a place called Tsitsikamma, which in the First Nations language means place of great water, place of much water. And indeed, it's a magnificent part of South Africa with river gorges and absolutely beautiful sea frontage. But Tsitsikamma has an interesting and in some ways a tragic story in that in the 60s, there was a marine protected area that was created in Tsitsikamma, the Tsitsikamma NPA. I believe it was 1969, I stand to be corrected. And at the time, the focus was on ensuring that marine life is protected at all costs. And local communities were basically moved from the area where they could fish, small-scale fishes, and then we moved further inland to a sort of township kind of context. And in 2021, we sent out our team of videographers and photographers, and they came across a small-scale fisher who told us his very tragic story of wanting to reconnect with the ocean and not being able to do so unless he actually crossed the national road to get to the other side in order to be able to access a part of the coast that is not governed by the NPA. The reason I'm telling this particular story is when we engage with scholarly accounts of marine protected areas, the narrative often is that this is absolutely essential for the protection of marine life. It is very, very important for the protection of the coast to ensure that there isn't overfishing and that certain species are protected in order to sustain the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem. I understand that. But the thing about the single story of marine protected areas is that we then miss what is actually happening to communities that are perhaps no longer able to access the ocean. In this particular story that I'm telling you about now, the person that we interviewed and other community members that we interviewed, we actually produced a short film on the story called Finding Eddie, which is available on YouTube. And we told the story of how, because of the lack of access to the ocean for leisure, for recreational fishing, and so on, there were quite a lot of social degradations that basically ensued in that community. And when we were interviewing some of the community members in 2021 and again in 2022, they were telling us now substance abuse is quite high in those communities. There's very little employment. It's difficult for people to feed themselves. They have these permitting conditions which they have to respect. And of course, all of that is to ensure that marine life is protected and that we ensure sustainability of critical fish stocks for the future. But those stories of environmental conservation have to be balanced with an account of access to the coast for sustainability, for livelihoods. And I think that narrative is beginning to change. If we look at other marine protected area projects that have been instituted since that time, there is now a recognition that there must be concessions actually made to some local people so that they can access the ocean for subsistence purposes at the very least. In the context of the analytical, which you asked me about earlier on, I use the term feminist eye, but I think it's more of a tool than anything else. I've certainly seen greater focus in my own work on what is known as sensory ethnography. So the perception of human relations with the sea and with water in the physiological sense, which we spoke about in one of our episodes, but also the role of that intimate connection, intimate human connection, the personal connection of humans to the ocean. I think this is very important because I've worked with colleagues in a variety of spaces across disciplinary boundaries in the ocean space. And the focus in those contexts has been mostly on macro-social, macro-political, macro-ecological aspects of ocean management and human relations with the sea. They have not really been about the personal, individual, intimate, politically nuanced, subjective experience of the ocean. And I think that is what I'm hoping to bring to the ocean cultures and heritage work, is that nuance and that intimate individual experience, to showcase that in the form of case studies and so on in the work that we're doing as a team.
Could you just give me some insight into how you could contribute these more feminist approaches in what seems to be a very masculine context? Even the women who work in marine spatial planning are often dividing up geographical areas on maps to say, this is where we're going to fish, this is where we're going to port, this is where we're going to do leisure. How does a softer, more subtle, more nurturing feminist perspective engage in such a masculine space successfully?
Yes, and I really like the comment that you made around spatial planning on even in the onshore context. I think that is quite an important part of cultural mapping, for example, that is taking place now in South Africa, identifying spaces that can be supposedly clearly demarcated and deemed to be of value. And therefore, if you have a significant quantum of culturally valuable sites in a particular area, it means that then you cannot or you should not be implementing projects that could be potentially damaging to the environment in that context. The research that we are doing is showing some really interesting flows and porosities that perhaps are not being picked up or being noted by the marine spatial planners. So, for example, again, in the South African case, we interviewed a Xhosa healer diviner. We've interviewed quite a few, but one of the ones that we interviewed explained to us how sites that are objectively identified as sacred for ritual use, for engagement with ancestral spirits or water spirits, that these are not static, that if there are certain bad events that take place in a particular area or the water is deemed to be unsuitable, then the water spirits will no longer be in that particular space. They will shift and they will move elsewhere. And it is imperative then to consult the healer diviner in order to understand the dynamic nature of the cultural and the sacred landscape. So with the sort of feminist, softer, I wouldn't say necessarily nurturing, but the softer, more open, the more dynamic, multi-sided kind of thinking, you're able to let go of the idea that culture and sacredness, that these things are immutable and that they will reside in particular spaces which can be objectively mapped and staked out and then provided to the decision makers so that a concrete decision can be made. The view that I present in much of the writing and the work that I do is to show that social life and cultural life is mutable and dynamic, that sacred sites can shift based on particular events which take place in a coastal context. This particular healer diviner that we interviewed in the Eastern Cape, she said to us that in some cases, the spirits that are important for the ritual process, they can enter into a particular animal. In the case that she told us was into a goose. And the goose will just walk off. They would be then called to basically ensure that this animal is actually safe until it finds the correct place where the ritual process can then continue apace. So what I'm trying to say is that because we live in a neoliberal modernist world where everything must be carefully mapped out and quantified and understood, and from that understanding supposedly resides in things that can be quantified and measured, we have lost sight of the fact that much of social and cultural life is actually very, very dynamic. Even cultural heritage, which I write about, obviously, as a heritage specialist, I write about a lot. Even cultural heritage is mutable, that it is socially constructed, that communities can forge and adapt and change a cultural heritage in order to meet particular psychosocial, spiritual, and even political needs. So you're right in that using this idea of the feminist eye is perhaps a little bit limiting. But I draw my inspiration from the very early work of Henrietta Moore, who wrote a phenomenal book called A Passion for Difference. And then also more recently, the work of Nina Cabral that I spoke about earlier in the series. And she talks about worldings. And the whole idea of worldings is that it encourages what they call perspectivism, that you must really get into a particular context. You must really have an emic or insider understanding of how it is that social and cultural dynamics basically unfold. And so analytically, when you are in a coastal community, your ethnographic eye is looking at what people say. You're hearing what people say about what they need, how their lives have unfolded since a particular event has occurred, coastal real estate development, marine protected area creation. And then you observe what is happening in the community where they live over a period of time. You arrive, you maybe stay there, or you interview people for the day, you observe for the day, you go away, you come back the next year and you observe again. So this idea of completed analysis is also something quite patriarchal and masculinist, and almost like I don't have an English word. I think I could make up one, a packagist kind of thinking, that you have a beginning and an end to this field research, to an understanding of social context. And that at the end of it, you provide the solid assessment and that's it. But what we're finding is that the situation is continuously evolving. The feminist eye, as it were, understands that things evolve over time and change, and that you have to move with the story and you have to see all the stories before you actually claim to have minimal understanding of what is happening in a community.
Is it perhaps a concern that while the slower, more feedback loop focused feminist approaches are occurring, that the traditional patriarchal, hierarchical, masculine approaches are getting away with what they want to get away with, and they're tolerating these interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches, but really business as usual continues?
I think that there is now greater recognition of the more nuanced, more feminist, more decolonial approaches to social reality and social analysis. I think ever since the unbelievable work of David Graeber, who's an anthropologist of the Southwest Indian Ocean, he wrote a phenomenal book called, I think it's called 5,000 Years of Debt, to try and understand how it is that we got caught up in the sort of neoliberal vision of the world. For me personally, anyway, ever since that book, I think that we've seen tremendous power and investment by many different communities, from Indigenous peoples to those who profess to be First Nations and Aboriginal, in public engagement on the need to have alternative views, alternative perspectives, and ways of engaging with the world in which we all live in. So I'm quite hopeful in that regard, because I see that there is effort from many different stakeholder groups to engage publicly in a narrative of who we are and what it is that we can do in this world that we live in that will benefit more people. Secondly, from the scholarly perspective, and certainly in social science, I have also seen not just transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, but I've also seen quite a lot of work that engages with what is known as transmateriality. So this thinking that humans are not also these porous, autonomous beings with already decided social an already decided social makeup or identity, that we also live as beings who have a transmaterial existence, that we live with the biotic and the abiotic. There's a really phenomenal article by Stephen Helmreich where he questions the sea within, looking at the human as an accumulation, as a space of incredible microbiotic diversity. It's a phenomenal article. Go and read it if you have the time to. But the point I'm trying to make is that it is not only society that is porous and dynamic and that has these kind of nuances. Human beings are also porous and dynamic entities, that we are not these autonomous bounded things. So that's also very interesting, because it challenges the Cartesian idea of humans being the ones who should decide for all species and all things. And that I think, the second point is that I wish to make, is this notion of transmateriality and questioning the supremacy and the power of human beings over nature and over unliving things. Thirdly, I think that we are in a bit of a predicament. So this is the sad part, I think. The predicament is that, sadly, money in many ways still rules the world. And what I mean by that is the fact of money and the importance given to the currency means that our power to negotiate alternative realities depends on our access to that currency. The fourth one, and I don't know if I'm going off topic here, but the fourth one, and that's the one which we often think about in the work that we're doing for the Blue Values Journey project, is the position of people who have not been able to make decisions for a very, very long time. So what can we do to basically give those communities a voice, to allow those alternative views and perspectives to come to the fore?